rated her, called her ugly and stupid, and then she was fired the day after this rant, with her lawyer releasing a statement saying, "Ye waged a relentless and deliberate campaign of anti-Semitism and misogyny against my client. We need to stop excusing Ye's behavior." Then, next up, we gotta talk about how officials at FEMA are defying court orders to comply with the Trump administration and firing those who refuse to do the same. Because FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, it's one of those agencies that's particularly drawn the ire of Trump and his supporters, and now, more than ever, it may be on the chopping block. Right? And to fully appreciate what's happening now, we gotta take it back to the second week of Trump's presidency first. Because that is when his administration ordered a government-wide funding freeze that quickly sparked not only confusion, but also major doubts about its constitutionality. With it then not being too long before a federal judge put a temporary pause on the funding freeze, and a second judge also issued a temporary restraining order against the directive just a few days later. And then, this week, that same judge said that the Trump administration had failed to comply with the order, and notably, that being the first time a judge has explicitly stated that the Trump administration is disobeying a judicial mandate. But despite that, it was just hours later when a senior FEMA official reportedly defied the order, sending an email instructing staff to freeze funding for various grant programs going back several years. With that, including those focused on emergency preparedness, homeland security, firefighting, protecting churches from terrorism, and tribal security. NBC News even reporting that it obtained screenshots of that email from a recipient who requested anonymity out of fear of reprisal, with that person also claiming that the official's instructions violated the court order and adding, "There's a lot of people who are running scared and trying to appease the new administration." And with that, you've got NBC reporting that civil servants are basically finding themselves caught between a rock and a hard place. Right, on one hand, they may technically be breaking the law if they do what they're told, but then on the other hand, they risk getting fired if they defy the Trump administration. That's not a hypothetical. Or with FEMA specifically, 4 employees were just terminated for dispersing federal funds to house migrants in New York City hotels. And those firings, notably, were just the latest in a chain of events set off by none other than Elon Musk. Or with Musk on Monday posting on X that the Doge team had discovered that FEMA had sent $59 million last week to luxury hotels in New York City to house unauthorized immigrants, and claiming that, quote, "sending this money violated the law and is in gross insubordination to the president's executive order," and adding, "that money is meant for American disaster relief and instead is being spent on high-end hotels for illegals." So with that, like so many of the things that we've talked about over the last 3 weeks, at the very least, it's not that simple. Right? One, while it may have been in defiance of the Trump administration, as we discussed, the Trump administration may actually be the one in defiance of the law. And two, the money, it wasn't meant for disaster relief, and according to city officials, it certainly wasn't being spent on high-end hotels. Like for example, the average cost for a hotel room in New York City, average cost, has recently exceeded $400 per night. But the average cost of a night stay for migrant families sheltered by this program, it's around $156. And probably more important with that, as far as this program, Musk seemed to be referring to payments made by the Shelter and Services Program, with that program notably being created by Congress back in 2023 to issue grants to groups and localities providing shelter and other services to migrants released by DHS custody after crossing the border. Also, the money for this program, it's actually been allocated to Customs and Border Protection, but because CBP doesn't have its own system for administering grant programs, the payments issued by the program were administered by FEMA. But still, this money is separate from the billions of dollars the agency spends on disaster relief. But despite all that, just 2 hours after Musk's post, FEMA's acting director announced that the payments in question had been suspended and said that the personnel would be held accountable. With then, less than a day later, a spokesperson for DHS, which oversees FEMA, announcing that the 4 employees, including the agency's chief financial officer, had been terminated for, quote, circumventing leadership to unilaterally make egregious payments for luxury New York City hotels for migrants, and saying, under President Trump and Secretary Noem's leadership, DHS will not sit idly and allow deep state activists to undermine the will and safety of the American people. And with that, some former senior officials at FEMA reportedly expressed concern, saying that the employees had been fired simply for doing their jobs by distributing federal funds as directed by Congress. But in any case, right, all of this, it's just one part of the battle over FEMA. Because as we've talked about, FEMA appears to have been a major target of dis and misinformation from Trump, Elon Musk, and their supporters ever since Hurricane Helene. And in the first week of his presidency, Trump talked about shutting down FEMA and then signed an executive order establishing a body to investigate the agency, which he accused of political bias, denying aid to his supporters, and spending billions to welcome unauthorized migrants. And then, less than 2 weeks later, DOJ reportedly gained access to FEMA's internal systems and began reviewing the grant programs that it uses to help communities prepare for and respond to disasters. With officials saying that a small team without security clearance accessed the agency's network containing the private and sensitive information of tens of thousands of disaster victims. With then, this weekend, the new Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem also talking about getting rid of FEMA, quote, the way it exists today. Finally, just yesterday, you had Trump taking to social media to say, the Biden-run FEMA has been a disaster. FEMA should be terminated. It has been slow and totally ineffective. Though, of course, with that, you have experts saying that Trump does not have the authority to terminate FEMA, saying that would require congressional action. But all of this, as we've talked about over the past 3 weeks, as Trump has been testing his power. We're seeing what he can do, understanding that there will be legal challenges, with many likely to go to the Supreme Court. But also with that, right, there's a lot of concern right now about what that could mean for disaster preparedness across the country. And again, as we've talked about with several different topics, that does not mean that FEMA cannot be improved upon and there shouldn't be criticism. For example, a guy who briefly served as FEMA administrator during Trump's first term, he claims there's actually a widespread agreement that the agency needs reform, but also also said that its preparedness and disaster response functions are in high demand and well executed, with him also telling Axios, we need a national effort to reform FEMA. I don't think anyone is arguing with the president on that, even people at FEMA. But the disassembly, the abolishment of FEMA is not in the national interest. But then, shifting gears, Trump just had his first confirmed conversation with Vladimir Putin since taking office last month, and he said that they agreed to negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. Or with Trump breaking the news on Truth Social and saying that the phone call was lengthy and highly productive, and noting that they discussed Ukraine, the Middle East, energy, AI, and more, and then added, we each talked about the strengths of our respective nations and the great benefit that we will someday have in working together. But first, as we both agreed, we want to stop the millions of deaths taking place in the war with Russia and Ukraine. With them adding, President Putin even used my very strong campaign motto of common sense, with him going on to claim that they've agreed to have their respective teams start negotiations immediately and that he plans on calling Ukraine's President Zelensky to inform him of their conversation. With him then thanking Putin for his time and effort with respect to this call, as well as yesterday's release of Mark Fogel, who's an American school teacher who was detained in Russia. With him then finally closing the statement by saying, I believe this effort will lead to a successful conclusion, hopefully soon. And as far as other details about the conversation, a Kremlin spokesperson told reporters that it lasted nearly an hour and a half and that they agreed to hold a personal meeting with Putin inviting Trump to Moscow. And while Trump didn't say whether or not he and Putin discussed Fogel on the call, many outlets did note that their conversation did follow a major prisoner swap. In exchange for Fogel's release, the U.S. freed a Russian national being held in the States for money laundering. And yesterday, we had Trump suggesting that Fogel's release could be the start towards building relations that would allow for the war to end. With many outlets also noting this comes as Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth recently said that a return to Ukraine pre-war borders is unrealistic. And, while Trump's post about the call notably did not specify where Zelensky fits into the negotiations, not long after Trump's announcement, Zelensky did take to Twitter to say, I had a meaningful conversation with POTUS. We long talked about opportunities to achieve peace, discussed our readiness to work together at the team level, and Ukraine's technological capabilities. With him adding, President Trump shared details of his conversation with Putin. No one wants peace more than Ukraine. Together with the U.S., we are charting our next steps to stop Russian aggression and ensure a lasting, reliable peace. As President Trump said, let's get it done. Right, and as this news broke, you saw a lot of outlets kind of noting the description of this call marking a shift in U.S.-Russia relations. With, for example, the Washington Post adding, in a highly charged choreography of diplomacy with an adversarial leader, the Trump-Putin call was likely to upset Kyiv since former President Joe Biden had a mantra of coordinating closely with Ukrainian leaders before any contacts with Russian officials. With him noting this time, Trump spoke first to Putin and then would call President Zelensky to loop him into the conversation. And then we'll get to more news in just a moment, but we're coming up on Valentine's Day and we should talk about something we don't normally discuss. Your relationship. Right? Falling in love, it could be exciting, but staying in love, that is where the real work happens, and that's exactly where today's sponsor, Paired, comes in. You see, Paired is a relationship app that helps couples actually stay in love. Right? Think daily conversation starters, expert advice, and fun activities that strengthen your bond. Because let's be real, life gets busy, the world's chaotic, and relationships take effort. And one of the things I love about Paired is how it makes relationship care a daily habit. You get engaging quizzes, meaningful challenges, and conversation prompts that help you connect on a deeper level. And understand, it's not just for couples going through rough patches either. Whether you're newly dating or been married for years, Paired helps keep that spark alive. And a really cool feature is the relationship timeline, right? It tracks your journey and helps plan for the future. I mean, sometimes we need that reminder of how far we've come. But my favorite feature, you can't see answers until you share yours. Turns out my wife thinks I take up too much space in bed, but she steals all the covers. Plus, I really like that everything in the app is backed by relationship experts and real research because at its core, great relationships are built on great communication. So if you're ready to strengthen your relationship, click the link below or scan the QR code and use code DeFranco to try Paired Premium and unlock all their best features. Trust me, your relationship will thank you. But then shifting gears to different news, I want to deep dive on something. What happens when someone has been sentenced to death in a state that doesn't carry out executions? Right? Because according to a recent Washington Post analysis, more than half of the 2,100 inmates in the U.S. sentenced to death are in jurisdictions where executions are on hold in one way or another. But this is also in many of those places, executions could resume at any time, whether by official decree or maybe a ruling getting overturned, for example. So you've got hundreds of inmates and the loved ones of countless victims just left in this limbo state while the debate surrounding the death penalty just drags on, waiting for an execution that may never happen. And a perfect example of this is John Lesko. Back in 1979 and early 1980, John Lesko and Mike Travaglia, they committed a string of violent robberies and they killed 4 people, with their 4th and final victim being Leonard Miller, a 21-year-old police officer in Apollo, Pennsylvania, who they shot and killed on January 3rd, 1980. But then later that day, the police storming the hotel room where Lesko and Travaglia were staying and they arrested them, and they were then sentenced to death for Miller's murder in 1982. And so off to death row they went, but they didn't go quietly, right? They spent decades filing appeals, and they even got a new sentencing that ended with the same result. But before they could be killed in 2015, Pennsylvania's governor placed a moratorium on executions. So what we ended up seeing is in 2017, Travaglia, he died of natural causes, and Lesko, he's still waiting for an execution to this day. But it also just isn't Lesko waiting here, right? People back in Apollo who loved Miller, they've also been waiting for decades. And in some cases, the wait's been so long that they've actually changed their minds about his sentence. Like with William Kerr, for example, who was mayor of Apollo at the time when Miller was killed, and Robin Davis, who was an officer in Apollo and later served as